On July 2, 1973, Frank Matthews, the most powerful independent black drug trafficker in American history, walked into a Brooklyn safe house, opened a hidden wall vault, removed nearly $20 million in cash, packed it into leather bags, picked up his girlfriend, drove to the airport and vanished forever. There was no body, no arrest, no confirmed sighting, and no grave. Just empty apartments, abandoned businesses, and one of the largest unsolved disappearances in criminal history. But law enforcement misunderstood what happened. Frank Matthews did not disappear out of fear. He did not run because he was losing, and he did not vanish by accident. He disappeared because 8 years earlier, Harlem legend Bumpy Johnson gave him a warning, one that saved his life, his freedom, and his fortune. Frank Matthews was not just another drug dealer. He controlled heroin and cocaine pipelines across 21 states, bypassed the Italian Mafia by dealing directly with international suppliers, and built a criminal empire so powerful that law enforcement admitted he was more dangerous than most mob families. By 1973, he had achieved something no black criminal before him had ever done: total independence at the highest level of organized crime. Then, suddenly, he walked away from everything. This story, however, begins in 1965 inside a Harlem nightclub when a young Brooklyn dealer sat across from Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man whose name carried weight across the entire underworld. What happened during that conversation would change criminal history forever. Frank Matthews was born in 1944 and raised in Brooklyn, New York. By his early 20s, he was already moving heroin in Bedford-Stuyvesant, not recklessly or loudly, but quietly and efficiently. He avoided flash, didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and stayed out of unnecessary conflict. Instead, he studied systems. While other dealers focused on territory and muscle, Matthews focused on logistics, supply chains, transportation routes, payment methods, and risk reduction. He wasn't interested in street corners, he wanted infrastructure. By 1965, at just 26 years old, Matthews was already making money, but more importantly, he understood something most criminals never did. Real power wasn't in violence, fear, or even territory. It was in organization. And he knew that if he wanted to scale beyond Brooklyn, he needed guidance from someone who had already survived decades at the top of the underworld. That man was Bumpy Johnson. By 1965, Bumpy Johnson was more than a gangster. He was a legend. He had ruled Harlem's numbers racket since the 1930s, survived wars with rival crews, negotiated directly with Lucky Luciano and the Italian Mafia as an equal, and endured 10 brutal years in Alcatraz. Unlike most criminals, Bumpy wasn't known for reckless violence. He was known for intelligence. He read Shakespeare in prison, quoted poetry, and played chess with mob bosses, both literally and figuratively. At 60 years old, however, Bumpy's health was declining. He had recently returned from prison and was rebuilding his Harlem operations while quietly thinking about mortality. Through a mutual connection, attorney Theodore Green, a meeting was arranged between Bumpy Johnson and the rising Brooklyn dealer Frank Matthews. Their first meeting took place in March 1965 at Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue in Harlem. It was a quiet Tuesday night, with low music and dim lighting, the kind of place where conversations stayed private. Bumpy arrived alone, walking with a cane. His body had weakened, but his presence still commanded respect. Matthews arrived nervous but respectful and stood when Bumpy approached. After studying Matthews, Bumpy told him that Theodore Green had described him as smart, strategic, and interested in building something bigger than street dealing. Matthews confirmed it. He said he wanted to build professional distribution networks that could handle volume and last, but he didn't know how to get from where he was to where he wanted to be. That answer impressed Bumpy. Most young dealers asked about guns, evading police, or intimidating rivals. Matthews asked about systems. Bumpy leaned back and told him he had maintained independence from the Italian Mafia through intelligence, not violence. When Matthews asked how, Bumpy explained that in 1935 he had played chess with Lucky Luciano and beaten him in 6 minutes. That game showed Luciano that Bumpy wasn't just another street operator, but a strategist worth respecting. After that, Harlem was granted autonomy, not out of fear, but out of respect. That, Bumpy said, was the lesson. Violence creates fear, but fear fades when someone more violent comes along. Intelligence creates value, and people protect value. Matthews absorbed every word. They talked for 3 hours about distribution, personnel, law enforcement, money laundering, and survival. When Matthews walked out that night, he wasn't just smarter, He was dangerous. From March 1965 until Bumpy's death in July 1968, the two men met every few months, sometimes in Harlem, sometimes in Brooklyn, sometimes at Bumpy's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. These weren't casual conversations. This was mentorship. Bumpy taught Matthews how to build multi-city networks without weak points, how to hire people loyal enough to work hard but not ambitious enough to overthrow him, how to operate under law enforcement pressure without drawing attention, how to invest illicit money into legitimate businesses, and how to think long-term instead of street-level. Matthews listened and, more importantly, he executed. By 1967, he was expanding beyond Brooklyn. By 1968, he was moving major shipments across multiple states. During one meeting in October 1967, Bumpy told him that while what he was building was impressive, the higher he climbed, the harder he would fall. Matthews questioned why he had to fall, and Bumpy explained that law enforcement never stops, competitors never stop, and the business itself is designed to destroy you through arrest, violence, betrayal, or something unpredictable. No one, he said, beats the game forever. Matthews nodded, but he still believed intelligence could beat the system. Bumpy knew better. On May 15, 1968, less than 2 months before his death, Matthews visited Bumpy at his Harlem apartment. Bumpy's heart was failing, and doctors had told him he didn't have long. They ate quietly and talked business. By then, Matthews was already handling international shipments, distributing across more than a dozen states, and generating money that put him among the wealthiest black criminals in America. After dinner, Bumpy told Matthews he was dying and wanted to pass on something important, something he himself had never successfully applied. He said, "Everything has a beginning and an end, but the art isn't in beginning. Anyone can start something. The art is knowing when to end and having the discipline to actually walk away when that moment comes." He admitted that he had never learned that lesson. He went to Alcatraz because he didn't know when to stop. He came back and rebuilt again. Now he was dying at 63 instead of living to 80 because he never learned when enough was enough. Bumpy told Matthews that he was smarter and more disciplined, and that one day he would reach a point where continuing wouldn't build wealth anymore. It would only risk everything he had already built. When that moment came, he said, Matthews needed to disappear with his money and his freedom before law enforcement destroyed him, competitors killed him, or betrayal took everything. When Matthews asked how he would know when that moment came, Bumpy told him he would feel it. As law enforcement pressure increased, too many people knew too much and the risk outweighed the reward. Before Matthews left that night, Bumpy told him not to let the business take everything from him the way it had taken everything from Bumpy. 7 weeks later, on July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack. Matthews stood at his funeral among hundreds of Harlem residents mourning a legend, remembering one sentence: "Everything has a beginning and an end, and the art is knowing when to end." After Bumpy's death, Frank Matthews didn't slow down. He accelerated. Between 1968 and 1973, he built the most powerful independent black drug empire in American history. He controlled heroin and cocaine distribution across 21 states, established direct relationships with suppliers in South America and Asia, cut out Italian mob middlemen, moved volumes rivaling major Mafia families, and amassed wealth estimated between $20 and $50 million in 1970s money. Unlike most traffickers, Matthews ran his empire like a corporation. He kept coded financial records, laundered money through legitimate businesses, avoided using drugs, limited violence, and paid associates well enough that loyalty made financial sense. Italian mob families didn't dominate him. They cooperated with him. Law enforcement knew his name, but couldn't touch him. By 1972, federal agents privately acknowledged that Matthews controlled the largest heroin network ever run by a black criminal organization in U.S. history. But Matthews noticed something else. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous the position became. The DEA had just been created in 1973 with massive resources. Italian families were growing uncomfortable with his independence. Law enforcement pressure was intensifying, and Matthews felt something shifting. He felt the moment Bumpy had warned him about. On July 2, 1973, Frank Matthews walked into his Brooklyn safe house, opened a hidden wall vault containing approximately $20 million in cash, removed the money, packed it into leather bags, picked up his girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, drove to the airport, and disappeared. There were no phone calls, no withdrawals, no sightings, no arrests, and no body. He left behind properties, businesses, operations, and associates who never heard from him again. Law enforcement launched massive investigations and found nothing. Some believed he was killed. Some believed he fled overseas. Some believed the Mafia got him. No evidence ever supported any theory. What law enforcement didn't know was that Matthews wasn't running. He was executing a plan planted in his mind 8 years earlier by Bumpy Johnson. Everything Bumpy had warned him about had arrived. Law enforcement pressure, rival tension, too many people knowing too much, and risk outweighing reward. And Matthews did something no major drug kingpin had ever successfully done. He walked away, not in handcuffs, not in a coffin, and not in prison, but free, with his money, his life, and his future. Frank Matthews became the only major American drug lord to disappear completely without being caught, confirmed dead, or located. For more than 50 years, he has remained one of law enforcement's most haunting mysteries. But maybe he isn't a mystery at all. Maybe he's proof that Bumpy Johnson's final lesson worked. Bumpy once said that everything has a beginning and an end, and the art is knowing when to end and having the discipline to do it. Bumpy never mastered that art. He went to prison, lost decades, and died early. But Frank Matthews did master it. And because of that, he vanished into history not as a victim, not as a prisoner, but as a ghost. Somewhere out there may be an old man living quietly, watching the world move on, knowing he pulled off what no other drug kingpin ever did. A clean exit, no prison, no grave, just silence. And maybe that's exactly how Frank Matthews wanted it.